Hi everyone, Psycho Sorcerer here. Today I'd like to talk to you about my recent experiences evoking the Morgan. As many of you know, I have a series on this channel called Get to Know a Deity, and in that series I review a specific deity each month and that deity's mythology, how they fit into their pantheon, as well as how they're usually used in magic whenever someone calls to them or does offerings to them. But in order to make sure everything is authentic, I always evoke those deities before releasing those videos. Usually what I do is I perform an evocation near the beginning of my research to kind of get a guidance. I reach out to see what I feel whenever I get a connection to these deities, and then ask for guidance as to where to look for the information that I was going to go into making the video about them. Sometimes this is successful, sometimes it's not. And then later, after I've produced the script that I'm going to use for the Get to Know a Deity session, I do another evocation to verify that what I'm going to say resonates with that deity. Another thing that I've said in the past that is still true is that any information I get from the deity that I'm not able to verify through my research, I don't include in the Get to Know a Deity because it is all supposed to be backed by sources. Once in a while there are things that I don't directly find a source for, but that I find sources for most of the material around it, which could draw any natural person to that final conclusion, and that final conclusion being something I was given when speaking to the deity. So in the cases where I include that, I make sure there's no citation at the bottom whenever I give that information, just as there's no citation at the bottom when I say what the deities are used for in magic, because those are my own interpretation of what a deity is used for, combined with the interpretations I've seen other people use for those deities. But those things aside, if a deity tells me something, if the entity I'm speaking to tells me something that I can't confirm in one way or another, it doesn't make it into the video. It stays in my grimoire where I write down all the notes of what I learned from the evocation, but it doesn't go into the video. And so I've gotten used to getting some things when evoking these deities that I can't corroborate. Once in a while, when I do this, I'll get information on that initial evocation that I'll later be able to confirm, and it actually happens more often than you'd think. I haven't thought too much of it before because I understand the concept of subconscious knowledge. So in my studies, as you've seen in earlier videos here in the lecture segment, I'm constantly trying to figure out if the deities are an archetype that we call upon that exists purely in our subconscious mind, or if our subconscious is reaching out to something else and the subconscious is just a vehicle for that communication. So if they're an archetype within the subconscious, that would mean that each of these deities is specific only to my own belief of what that deity would be. I'm seeing an incarnation of that archetype within myself. Whereas if I'm using my subconscious as a vehicle to speak to an outside entity, I would be either reaching out to something that exists as an independent being, or I would be reaching out to some kind of force in the universe that's manifesting itself in a way that I can understand. So this is something I've always tried to prove, but it's hard to prove. Meanwhile, in numerous occasions, whenever I do these evocations, the information I get on the initial evocation will lead me to a lot of information that will back up what I was told. But for my first, I want to say 10 videos on Get to Know a Deity, I was doing the Babylonian gods, which I've done some research in the past, I had a better knowledge of, and I have not quite as good a knowledge of the Babylonian gods starting out as I did with the Greek and Roman gods, but I had a pretty good knowledge of them, and I had done research prior to starting that whole series. So when I evoked a Babylonian god and it told me something that I didn't know about it, and I was able to confirm it later, there's always that doubt that I was speaking to something external to me, because it's entirely possible that it's something that I recalled subconsciously from previous research. Recently I did a video on Osiris. This happened again, but it's not that strange either because I knew a lot about Osiris before I did that video. In fact, the reason I chose Osiris as my 11th video was just because I needed to start moving outside of the Babylonian pantheon, and I went with someone I knew. However, the Morgan, which was my 12th video, was a viewer recommendation. One of the viewers said, hey, could you do one on the Morgan? And I said, sure. And I decided to do research, and this one was a lot more research intensive because I haven't actually worked with any of the Celtic deities before, and I didn't really know much about the Celtic system of deities before. So all of what went into this video was new to me, new research. But I still did the initial evocation before diving too deeply into the roots of the Celtic mythology. And when I spoke to the Morgan, I had a really weird experience. First of all, it was more powerful than most evocations that I do, and that in and of itself was strange. There was a different feeling to it than any of the other deities that I've worked with before. It almost didn't feel like I was working with a deity, and so in the interview, I actually felt a desire to ask the question, are you actually a deity? And the Morgan explained that she was a member of the people of Danu, and that she wasn't a deity per se, but rather was something in between the walks of a fairy and a human. And that she lived in another world but could affect this world, and also that she represented a force, that she was an incarnation of a force of energy. Now, I've heard the theory that the different deities could be representations of forces before, but I've never had an evoked deity tell me this straight out before. And so I didn't think too much of it. It didn't seem like proof that the Morgan was real at the time, because it just seemed like, okay, this is confirmation of my belief that deities could be incarnations of forces, but who's to say this isn't just my own wishful thinking projecting itself into this evoked form? But then I did my research, and I found out about something that really shook me up. So the Morgan is part of a group called the Tuatha De Danann, which apparently is the people of Danu. Now, when I had spoken to the Morgan, she had actually said she was one of the people of Denai, which perhaps is a pronunciation, but I didn't know about the Tuatha De Danann whenever I spoke to her, and in fact this was an entirely new concept when I found it. In all of my research into the Morgan, trying to understand how she fit into the pantheon, this kept getting brought up, and so eventually I decided, well, I have to research the Tuatha De Danann itself just to understand the Morgan. And so I did the research on that, and what I found was that the ancient Celts believed that these beings, called the Tuatha De Danann, were not deities per se, but were rather a form of fae folk, a form of fairies from the other world, but not like the normal fairies they ran into. And it said specifically that each member was a representation of some natural force. Now, when I read this, it floored me because this is exactly how the Morgan had explained herself to me, but I had no way to have had it so close. I mean, not only had she said she was a representation of a force, but she had specified she was in between the fairies and the humans. She had specified she was from another world, but could interact with this one. I mean, everything about how she described herself was exactly what a Tuatha De Danann was. And in fact, there was a point in our conversation during the first evocation where I asked her what she was specifically, and she said I didn't have a word in my mind that would describe it. And let me explain also, when I do evocation, I try to channel. So initially I'll do an evocation where I can feel the presence of an entity around me, but then my method of being able to speak with them is to channel. Once I'm sure, positive that the energy feels right, I will offer to allow the entity to speak through me, and I'll record it in an auditory fashion, not on video, so that I can listen back to it later, and that way I can just have a conversation without worrying about recording everything down. But it was weird. This particular evocation happened faster, more quickly, more pure feeling than what I normally have. This channeling, it filled my whole body with a different feeling when I did it, and that's happened to me on a few other occasions, but it was a very strong channel. So if anyone here has ever done channeling before, one thing that you know is when an entity is speaking through you, they use the vocabulary and they use the grammar and they use the language that already exists in your mind. They aren't speaking through you as them, they are sending you what to say. And so if in your mind you are missing a concept they're trying to relay, you will get a blank. And that happened to me with this, where when I asked, what are you, there was this long pause, and then I asked, are you an angel? No. Are you a demon? No. Are you a deity? No. And then it went into an explanation, which is what led to the whole between fairies, between humans, an incarnation of a force, etc. She also described herself in a similar light to a guide or guardian angel, but instead of being an individual's guide, she said she was a universal guide to what she explained to be fate or synchronicity or things of that nature. So all of this was interesting to me. I listened to it, I wrote it down, I stored it for later, went and did my research, came back and went, side by side looking and said, there's nothing that she told me that I couldn't use, which is phenomenal. But it's made me have to question. So in the past when I've gotten this sort of confirmation, I've already known so much before that initial consultation that I don't feel confident saying it's definitely proof that I'm talking to something external. But this I really, truly didn't know before. And it's not proof, obviously, it's an experience I had, and you have to take me at my word on this, but it has made me question. Now, I already was questioning whether these entities were a part of our mind or were an external force, but this has slid my belief far toward external force. It's really making me think. It's really making me think a lot harder about this. Not even necessarily in a, how do I put this? I feel like I'm on the border of just accepting that this is proof that they are external. This, combined with the orbs I see, combined with some of the experiences I've had in asking them to do things for me and having it happen, it's really moving me into the camp of believing that I'm not just talking to my own subconscious, but rather the subconscious is a vehicle to talk to something external. Now, again, the question becomes, is it an entity or force? But from what the Morgan said about herself, it's a little of both. It's an entity representing a force. So maybe it's just that these evoked beings are our mind's way of giving the force form so that we can speak to it. I don't know. But I definitely have moved steadily since this into the camp of spirits are real, entities are real, deities are representations of forces, or at least some of them are. Our servitors aren't just something mental inside, but maybe are actually being created on the astral plane, maybe are actually existing and affecting the world, things of this nature. The more that I investigate this, the more I'm sliding in that direction of thinking. And that direction of thinking, while exciting, is somewhat disturbing, because if it's wrong, it can lead you into dangerous territory, dangerous ways of thinking. But if it's right and you ignore it, then you're ignoring the reality of how the world works. So I'm going to continue to dive in this direction, and I have this experience to thank for that, but I do so cautiously, and I'm interested if any of you have had similar experiences that, at least to yourselves, proved that these evocations are speaking to external sources, not just yourself. because it seems to me that the longer I do this, the more I do it, the more confirmation I'm getting. And at this point, it's almost starting to feel like holding on to the idea that it's not an external force is a form of me just holding on to old belief. And perhaps it's time to move forward and accept the truth. So let me know what you think. Until next time, safe travels. Thanks for watching. If you liked what you saw, please consider giving this video a thumbs up and sharing it on social media. If you'd like to stay updated with my latest videos, please click subscribe. If you have a comment or question, please feel free to leave it below or on my Facebook page. And if you'd like to see some of my previous work, check out Psycho Sorcerer channel on YouTube. If you're interested in learning about the occult, I've got an over 35-part lecture series. You can reach that by clicking on the video in the top left. I've also got an ongoing series on the ancient gods and how they're called upon in magic. If you're interested in that, that's in the top right. I've got a series on theories from conspiracies to big questions in the bottom left, and tips for a better life through magic in the bottom right. If you can't click on any of these videos because you're on a phone or tablet that doesn't support it, you can always go to my channel and check out the playlist section. I've got everything broken down into playlists there. There's also an additional playlist of me making a complete fool of myself doing various pop culture things, including pretending to be a character that's what pop culture thinks a sorcerer would be. As always, I thank you for your support, and until next time, safe travels.